Picture this, it's a cold morning somewhere in the mountains of the American West. The wind cuts through old wooden buildings that haven't seen a worker in over a century. Rusted train tracks disappear into a hillside, swallowed by darkness. If you walked up to that opening and looked inside, you'd see something strange. Tools left exactly where men dropped them. Or carts still loaded, frozen in time as if everyone just walked away, not because they wanted to. Not because the gold or silver or copper ran dry, but because of something far bigger, something that had almost nothing to do with what was buried in the rock. For decades, we've been told a simple story. The miners dug and dug until there was nothing left, and then they packed up and went home. Ore ran out, town died, end of story. It's a clean explanation. It fits in a textbook sentence, and it's mostly wrong. The truth is messier, and honestly, a lot more interesting. The closing of America's great pre-1900 mines wasn't really about empty veins of metal. It was about money, power, politics, war, and the slow collapse of a way of life that the country had built its entire economy around. Today, we're going to walk through that story together. We're going to step into the boots of the miners, the bankers, the politicians, and the towns that lived and died with the swing of a pickaxe. By the end, you'll understand why those tunnels really went dark, and why the answer says more about America itself than about any rock in the ground. Let's start in the 1850s and 1860s, when mining wasn't just an industry, it was a fever. Word would spread that someone struck gold or silver in some remote canyon, and within weeks, thousands of people would show up. Farmers, soldiers, immigrants from Ireland, China, Cornwall, Mexico, all of them chasing the same dream. Overnight, tent camps became towns. Towns became cities. Places like Virginia City, Nevada, exploded from nothing into a bustling metropolis with theaters, newspapers, and fancy hotels, all because of one massive deposit of silver and gold called the Comstock Lode. Now here's something most people don't realize. These early mining booms weren't just about getting rich. They were tied directly to the survival of the entire United States government. During the Civil War, the Union desperately needed money to fund its armies. Silver and gold from places like the Comstock Lode helped back the currency and pay for the war effort. Mining wasn't a side hustle. It was a matter of national survival. But here's the thing about a fever. Eventually it breaks. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, something started happening across mining regions all over the country. The easy stuff was gone. Not all of it, but the easy stuff. See, when a vein of silver or gold or copper is first discovered, it's often near the surface, rich and relatively simple to dig out. The deeper you go, the harder it gets. You need better pumps to keep water out. You need stronger supports to keep tunnels from collapsing. You need more powerful and more expensive equipment to crush and process low-grade ore. So already, by the 1880s, many mines were becoming massive industrial operations rather than simple digging holes. And that meant only big companies with deep pockets could keep them running. The lone prospector with a mule and a pan was becoming a figure of the past, even though popular imagination still pictures him as the face of American mining. Now let's talk about the real turning point, and this is where the story gets interesting. In 1873, the United States government made a decision that would echo through mining towns for the next 20 years. They passed a law that effectively stopped the government from buying silver to mint into coins at the old fixed rate. Silver miners called this the crime of 73. Almost overnight, the value of silver started to slide. Think about what that meant for a town built entirely around silver mining. Imagine you're a miner in a place like Leadville, Colorado, or Tombstone, Arizona. You wake up one day, go down into the same tunnel you've worked for years, dig out the same rock you've always dug out, and suddenly that rock is worth less money. Not because there's less of it, not because it's lower quality, but because some decision made in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away, just changed the rules of the game. This wasn't a one-time event either. Throughout the 1880s and into the 1890s, the US government kept flip-flopping on silver policy. They'd pass laws to support silver prices, then repeal them, then debate new ones. Miners, investors, and entire towns were basically riding a financial roller coaster they had zero control over. And then came 1893. This year is one of the most overlooked turning points in American mining history, and it deserves way more attention than it gets. In 1893, the United States plunged into a massive economic depression, one of the worst the country had ever seen. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and right in the middle of this chaos, the government repealed a major law that had been propping up silver purchases. The effect was immediate and brutal. Silver prices crashed. And when silver prices crash, what happens to silver mines? They become unprofitable, not because the silver disappeared, but because selling it no longer covered the cost of getting it out of the ground. Picture the scene in a town like Aspen, Colorado, which at the time was one of the richest silver mining areas in the world. Within months, mines that had employed thousands of workers shut their gates. Not gradually, almost overnight. Miners who had steady jobs one week were suddenly unemployed the next, with families to feed and no warning that it was coming. Whole communities that had been booming just months earlier became ghost towns within a year or two. The buildings were still standing. The streets were still there, but the people were gone, scattered to find work wherever they could. This is one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle that the ran out of ore story completely ignores. Many of these mines still had silver in them, plenty of it in some cases, but it didn't matter. The economics had changed beneath their feet, and no amount of digging could fix that. But silver wasn't the only metal with a dramatic story. Let's shift gears and talk about copper, because copper tells us a different, but equally important, part of this puzzle. In the late 1800s, copper became incredibly valuable for a very modern reason: electricity. As America began wiring homes, cities, and factories with electrical systems, the demand for copper wire exploded. Places like Michigan's Upper Peninsula, especially around Calumet and Hecla, became some of the richest copper mining regions in the entire world. For decades, these mines thrived, but by the 1890s and into the early 1900s, a new problem emerged, and it had nothing to do with running out of copper. It had to do with where the copper was located and how deep miners had to go to get it. Some of these Michigan copper mines eventually became among the deepest mines on the entire planet, reaching depths of well over a mile underground. At that depth, you're dealing with intense heat, constant flooding, and incredibly dangerous working conditions. The cost of ventilating, pumping water, and hauling rock up from such extreme depths skyrocketed. Meanwhile, new copper discoveries out west, in places like Montana, Arizona, and Utah, offered copper that was easier and cheaper to extract using newer techniques, especially something called open-pit mining, where instead of tunneling underground, companies simply carved giant terraces into the earth from the surface. So even though the old Michigan mines still had copper deep below, companies started shifting their money and attention to these newer, cheaper operations out west. It wasn't that the copper disappeared from Michigan, it's that mining it became more expensive than mining it somewhere else. And in business, that difference is everything. Now let's talk about something that almost never gets mentioned in these conversations: labor and human cost. Mining in the 1800s was brutal, truly brutal. Workers faced collapsing tunnels, toxic gas, explosions, and diseases caused by breathing in rock dust day after day. As the decades went on, miners began organizing. They formed unions. They went on strike, demanding better pay, safer conditions, and shorter workdays. Mine owners, naturally, didn't love this. Some of the most violent labor conflicts in American history happened in and around mining towns during this era. Strikes were sometimes met with armed guards, and in some tragic cases, actual gunfights between miners and hired security forces or even state militias. These conflicts didn't just cause human tragedy, they disrupted operations constantly. Mines would shut down for weeks or months during strikes. Investors grew nervous. Some companies decided it simply wasn't worth the constant turmoil, especially when metal prices were already shaky because of all that political back and forth over silver and gold we talked about earlier. So you start to see the picture forming, right? It's not one single dramatic reason mines closed. It's a perfect storm: falling prices because of government monetary policy, rising costs because mines were getting deeper and more dangerous, competition from newer and cheaper mining regions, and constant labor conflict making operations unstable. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's something that connects directly to the world we live in today: the environment. Even in the 1800s, long before anyone used the word environmentalism, mining had massive effects on the land and water around it. Picture a mountain valley with a clear, cold river running through it. Now picture that same river, years later, running orange or grey, choked with waste rock and chemicals used to separate metal from ore. In several mining regions, the pollution got so bad that it started affecting farmland, killing fish populations, and even harming the health of people living downstream. By the late 1800s, some of these problems were becoming impossible to ignore. Lawsuits started piling up. Farmers and ranchers who depended on clean water for their crops and livestock began taking mining companies to court, demanding they pay for the damage or stop operations altogether. In a few notable cases, courts actually sided with the farmers. Some mining and smelting operations were ordered to either dramatically reduce their pollution or shut down certain operations entirely. For mining companies already struggling with falling metal prices and rising operational costs, these legal battles were sometimes the final straw. Why pour money into expensive pollution controls and endless court fights when you could simply close that operation and redirect your investment to a newer mine somewhere else, in a place with fewer legal headaches? So now let's put it all together. Imagine you're the owner of a mining company in, say, 1895. You're looking at your books, and here's what you see. Silver prices have crashed because of government policy changes you have no control over. Your mine is getting deeper, which means higher costs for pumping, ventilation, and equipment. Your workers are organizing and threatening strikes over pay and safety. And on top of all that, a judge just ruled that you need to either clean up your waste discharge or face even more lawsuits. Meanwhile, your competitor just opened a brand new operation out west, using cheaper open-pit methods, in a region with friendlier laws and fresher ore deposits that don't require digging a mile underground. What would you do? For company after company, across mining region after mining region, the answer became the same. Close the old mine, walk away, let the buildings crumble, let nature slowly reclaim the tunnels. It wasn't a dramatic decision made in some smoky boardroom with a single signature, though sometimes it kind of was. More often, it was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow accumulation of financial pressures until one day it simply wasn't worth it anymore to keep digging. And here's the part that I think is the most haunting. In many of these abandoned mines, geologists who studied them decades later found that significant amounts of valuable metal were still down there. Not always, some mines genuinely had been mostly worked out, but in plenty of cases, the metal was still there, waiting. The mines didn't close because the earth had given up everything it had. They closed because the world around those mines had changed in ways that made digging it out no longer worth the cost. Think about what that means. For over 100 years, countless towns across America have carried the same story passed down through generations. The mine closed because it ran dry. Families believed it. Local museums displayed it. It became part of the regional identity, this idea that the land had simply been used up. But in reality, in so many of these places, the true reason was tangled up in Washington politics, global metal markets, labor wars, environmental lawsuits, and competition from newer, richer deposits discovered elsewhere. It's almost poetic in a strange way. These mines weren't abandoned because nature said no more. They were abandoned because human systems, economies, governments, courts, and unions shifted underneath them, just like the rock itself. So next time you see an old photo of an abandoned mining town, or you stumble across one of those rusted-out headframes standing alone on a hillside, remember this. That mine probably isn't empty because the earth ran out of treasure. It's empty because, at some point, the people above ground decided the treasure wasn't worth fighting for anymore. Not against falling prices, not against deeper tunnels, not against angry workers, and not against rivers turning the wrong color. The gold and silver and copper are often still down there, sealed away in the dark, waiting in tunnels that haven't felt a human footstep in well over 100 years. Not lost, not gone, just left behind by a world that moved on to easier, cheaper, and less complicated places to dig. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding in these old mining towns. It's rarely the resource itself that determines when something ends. It's the world around it, the economy, the politics, the people, that decides when it's time to walk away, even if there's still treasure waiting in the dark below. Here's a closing section you can add to wrap the story up with one final gut punch. Now, before we leave these mountains and these silent tunnels behind, there's one more thing worth sitting with for a moment. Today, some of these old mining districts are getting a second look. With modern technology, equipment that didn't exist 100 years ago, companies are going back into areas once written off as played out. And in more than a few cases, they're finding that the old miners barely scratched the surface of what's actually down there. Deposits once considered too low grade to bother with are now profitable, thanks to better extraction methods. Tunnels abandoned in the 1890s are being reopened, mapped, and in some cases, mined all over again. So in a strange twist, the very thing the old textbooks told us, that the ore simply ran out, is being proven wrong, one reopened mine at a time. And that brings us back to where we started, standing at the mouth of that old tunnel, looking into the darkness, knowing that somewhere down there, the rock is still holding on to secrets it never gave up. The miners who walked away didn't lose a race against an empty mountain. They lost a race against time, against politics, against markets, against a world that was changing faster than any pickaxe could keep up with. The mountain never stopped offering what it had. It was the people above ground who, for 100 different reasons, stopped reaching for it. And maybe, somewhere out there right now, in some quiet valley you've never heard of, there's another old mine just like this one, waiting, patiently in the dark, for the world to come back around again.